Hey guys, welcome back. So tonight, let's dim the lights, grab a blanket, maybe a snack that doesn't resemble 14th century gruel, unless you're going full immersive experience. And let's drift back to a time when eating was, let's just say, not quite Michelin-star dining. Because tonight, we're asking a very simple, very sleepy question. What on earth did ordinary people eat during the Black Death? Now, of course, you might be picturing medieval folks chewing on giant turkey legs like at a Renaissance fair or sipping goblets of wine while singing bawdy songs. That image works for knights and lords and costume dramas. But for the average peasant farmer, which was basically 90% of Europe, the reality was more beige and lumpy and sometimes actively terrifying. So let's just drift into that world. First, the setting. It's the mid-14th century. Europe has just been hit by the bubonic plague, or as we like to call it now, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, it managed to wipe out somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population. Which, if you think about it, is like if half the people in your city suddenly disappeared, leaving behind empty houses, half-plowed fields, and a general vibe of apocalyptic despair. And yet, people still had to eat. You couldn't just say, "Sorry, I can't harvest the wheat, there's a pandemic." The cows still needed milking, bread still needed baking, and people still sat down every day to eat whatever they could scrape together. Food didn't stop just because half the village did. So, what did ordinary people actually eat? Let's start with the foundation of medieval diets, bread, because bread was basically life. If you were an English peasant in 1349, you weren't asking what's for dinner. You were asking whether there was bread for dinner. But not the fluffy, soft, golden loaves we think of, no sourdough starters being lovingly tended in Instagrammable jars. Medieval bread was often heavy, coarse, and sometimes literally dangerous. In bad years, it might be mixed with beans, peas, or even ground up acorns to stretch it further. The good stuff, white wheat bread, was reserved for nobles and clergy. Ordinary people were stuck with darker, denser loaves made of rye or barley, which occasionally came with a fun side effect called ergot poisoning. Yes, imagine trying to enjoy your slice of rye bread only to discover it was laced with a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations, gangrene, and sometimes mass outbreaks of what medieval people called St. Anthony's fire. So, not exactly a five-star dining experience. And alongside bread, there was pottage. Now, pottage is one of those words that sounds cozy, like something you'd want simmering in a cottage kitchen. In reality, it was just mush, a kind of stew made by throwing whatever grains, beans, and vegetables you had into a pot, boiling it until it all turned into a gloopy mass, and calling it dinner. Picture a thick oatmeal, but with random cabbage leaves, onions, maybe a carrot if you were lucky, and sometimes, on very good days, a scrap of meat. Not a steak, more like a suspicious piece of pig fat floating on top. People ate pottage constantly, morning, noon, and night. Because it was filling, it used whatever was on hand, and it could be reheated endlessly. Medieval Tupperware was just leaving the pot by the fire and hoping it didn't grow mold before tomorrow. Speaking of meat, let's talk about that. We sometimes imagine the Middle Ages as full of hearty meat feasts, big roasts, endless legs of lamb, but ordinary peasants? Not so much. Meat was rare, expensive, and often forbidden by the church on countless fasting days. And when I say countless, I mean literally over 150 days a year where eating meat was banned. So peasants had to get creative. On fasting days, they might eat fish, if they lived near a river, or if salted herring was available from the Baltic trade. But for many, fish was a luxury too. So you'd fall back on beans, peas, and that eternal favorite, more pottage. When meat did appear, It was usually salted pork, maybe some bacon scraps, or if you were really rural, whatever animal you could catch. Rabbits, chickens, pigeons, basically medieval fast food. And let's not forget that hunting large game, deer, boar, anything that looks majestic, was legally reserved for nobles. So no, your average plowman wasn't sneaking off for venison steaks. Unless he wanted to risk being hanged for poaching, which was not the ideal end to a dinner party.
Now, the Black Death made all of this even stranger. Because with so many people dead, there was suddenly fewer mouths to feed, which meant in some regions, survivors could actually eat better. Laborers demanded higher wages. Grain was a little more available. Some peasants who had been barely scraping by before the plague suddenly found themselves with better access to bread, meat, or dairy than ever before. But in other places, especially cities, food supplies collapsed. Fields went unharvested, animals roamed untended, markets emptied. Imagine walking through a half-deserted town with no bakers left to bake bread, no butchers left to slaughter animals, and wondering if the stale onion in your pocket was the last vegetable you'd see all week. So, food became even more uneven. If you were lucky, you feasted. If not, you starved. And in famine years, which still happen frequently, people resorted to some grim measures. Contemporary accounts mention peasants making bread from ferns, tree bark, or literally sawdust. So if you're ever disappointed by your grocery store bread, just remember, at least it's not 13.49 bark loaf. And of course, let's not forget dairy. Milk, butter, and cheese were staples of the peasant diet. But again, don't imagine neat little rounds of cheddar wrapped in wax. This was raw milk drunk quickly before it spoiled. Cheese was soft, crumbly, and probably tasted like a cross between sour yogurt and damp hay. Still, it provided protein, and it could be stored a little longer than milk. Butter, too, was useful, though in southern Europe, people leaned more toward olive oil, while in northern regions, butter was standard. Sometimes salted, sometimes not, often going rancid faster than you'd want to think about. And what about drinks? Well, water was not always safe. Streams near towns were basically medieval sewage systems, so people drank a lot of ale, weak beer, brewed at home, often cloudy, low in alcohol, but safer than water. Even children drank it daily. Wine was more common in southern Europe, though peasants usually had the cheap stuff. Think sour, watery, maybe half-fermented wine, not the refined vintages monks were hoarding in their monasteries. But hey, it got the job done. So to sum it up, the ordinary person during the Black Death was mostly eating coarse bread, endless pottage, occasional beans, scraps of salted meat, maybe some sour cheese, and washing it all down with ale that looked suspiciously like dishwater. And yet, that was survival. It was dull, it was repetitive, and it wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it kept people alive in a world where life was short, brutal, and suddenly full of plague pits. Now, before we drift off too quickly, let's gently float into the next layer of the story. Because diet wasn't just about survival, it was also about social class. What you ate told the world who you were. The nobles up on the hill, they were eating white bread, venison, roast swan, and imported spices. Meanwhile, the peasant in the field was chewing his way through cabbage stew for the sixth night in a row. And that contrast only grew sharper during the Black Death. So in the next part, we'll drift into that fascinating and sometimes absurd divide between noble dining and peasant meals, and how the plague reshaped what went on the medieval table. But for now, just picture that humble bowl of pottage, simmering endlessly, a little smoky, a little bland, maybe with a chunk of bread to dip in. That was dinner, night after night, year after year, through plague, famine, and fear. Not glamorous, not delicious, but it kept the world turning.
So in past, we settled into the daily diet of your average 14th century peasant. Bread, pottage, more bread, some cheese if you were lucky, and ale that tasted like slightly cleaner pond water. Now let's drift up into the smoky halls of the nobility, because while peasants were spooning cabbage stew, nobles were staging full-scale productions at the dinner table. Food in medieval Europe wasn't just about staying alive, it was a social performance, A way of declaring, look at me, I'm rich. I can afford to roast a peacock and sprinkle cinnamon on it. Because if there's one universal constant in history, it's that rich people will always find ways to turn food into a flex. Let's start with bread again, because bread was such a cultural marker. If you were noble, you didn't touch that dark rye peasant loaf. No. Your bread was fine, white wheat flour, soft, fluffy, carefully sifted. They even had something called manchet bread, small, white, perfectly shaped loaves baked just for the upper classes. The whiter the bread, the higher your social standing. And yes, this is ironic, because modern people now pay extra for artisanal brown bread full of grains, while medieval peasants would have traded an arm to chew on Wonder Bread. Then there was meat. Peasants got the scraps, but nobles feasted like it was always Thanksgiving. They had venison, roasted boar, swans, cranes, herons, even dolphins. Yes, dolphins, because apparently someone looked at a sleek, intelligent sea creature and thought, that belongs on my platter with a nice gravy. They also ate peacocks, not just roasted, but redressed in their feathers afterward, so it looked like a glorious bird rising from the table, except, crispy. That's medieval dinner theater for you. And of course, all of this was slathered in spices, imported cinnamon, ginger, saffron, and cloves. Luxuries brought over trade routes stretching to the Middle East and Asia. Spices were the medieval equivalent of wearing designer labels. If your venison stew was dusted with nutmeg, it wasn't just tasty, it screamed, I am wealthier than you will ever be. And fish was another big deal. Remember how peasants only occasionally had access to fish? Nobles, on the other hand, had carp ponds, river rights, and the ability to import salted delicacies. On fasting days, when meat was banned, they could still indulge in elaborate fish dishes, stuffed eels, roasted salmon, lampreys in sauce. Meanwhile, peasants were stuck with beans. Again. And just to add a twist, sometimes nobles pretended fish was meat, or meat was fish, through elaborate recipes that disguised one as the other. A kind of medieval food cosplay, because apparently fasting rules were made to be bent, if you had the money. Now vegetables. Here's where things get weird. Peasants ate vegetables constantly. Onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, whatever they grew. But nobles often avoided vegetables. They were considered low-class food, something for peasants, not for lords. If vegetables appeared at a noble table, they were usually buried under rich sauces or treated as decoration. So yes, the people breaking their backs in the fields were basically eating a proto-vegan diet, while the lords and ladies were avoiding leafy greens like they were beneath them. And let's not forget about the sugar. Sugar was still an expensive luxury, shipped all the way from the Mediterranean or even further. But if you could afford it, you showed it off. There were elaborate sugar sculptures, castles, animals, even little ships, brought out at feasts purely to impress. Imagine eating your way through an edible sugar fortress while your peasants outside were gnawing on barley crusts.
Now the plague, the Black Death, threw all of this into chaos. Because with half the population gone, food supplies shifted dramatically. In some places, nobles couldn't source their usual luxuries. Imagine being a lord used to peacock and saffron, suddenly forced to eat salted pork like a commoner. Tragic. Devastating. Truly, the worst hardship possible. But in other regions, nobles doubled down. They kept importing spices, sugar, and fine wines, even as their villages shrank around them. Feasts became a way of insisting that life went on, that they were still in control, still above the chaos. And let's talk about those feasts. Noble banquets during and after the plague weren't just dinners. They were spectacles. Long tables groaning under roasted meats, fish pies, trenchers of white bread, endless cups of wine, and musicians playing in the background. Servants scurrying about with jugs and platters, dogs snuffling under the table for scraps. The whole performance was meant to reassure everyone. Yes, half the village may be gone, but look, the Lord still eats swan with cinnamon glaze. The world hasn't ended. Of course, in reality, it had changed. Meanwhile, peasants noticed something. With so many people dead, labor became scarce, which meant wages rose, which meant some survivors could suddenly afford more than just endless cabbage stew. They could buy better bread, maybe some meat, maybe a little ale that wasn't entirely swampy. And this new prosperity worried nobles deeply, because if peasants started eating better, dressing better, and demanding more, the whole social order looked shaky. Food, once again, wasn't just food. It was politics. So here's the contrast, laid out side by side. Peasants, rough bread, pottage, beans, occasional salted meat, endless ale. Nobles, white bread, venison, exotic birds, sugar sculptures, spice-laden dishes, endless wine. Same world, different tables. And here's a little ironic twist to drift off on. While nobles were gorging themselves on rich meats, sauces, and sugar, peasants' simpler diets of grains and vegetables may have been healthier in the long run. Fewer kidney stones, less gout. Nobles spent their later years limping around with swollen joints and ulcers, while peasants, well, they died young of other causes, but at least not from eating too many stuffed lampreys. So, as the Black Death rolled on, food told the story of class, of survival, of wealth, and poverty sitting side by side. Bread crusts and sugar castles. And in the next part, we'll slip into the world of how famine and plague changed agriculture itself. Abandoned fields, wandering animals, shifting diets, and the strange aftertaste of a continent trying to recover. But for now, let's just picture that long medieval hall, lit by firelight, where a lord is carving into a roasted boar, while a servant ladles pottage into a wooden bowl for the kitchen staff. Same world, different tables.
So we've already set the table. One side with barley bread and ale, the other with sugar castles and roasted peacocks. But the real question is, who was even farming all of this food once the Black Death swept through? Because here's the thing, you can have all the land in the world, but if half the farmers are gone, the cows don't milk themselves. The wheat doesn't politely harvest itself. And the pigs? Well, the pigs probably did just fine wandering loose. But you get the point. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It disrupted the entire chain of food production. Fields were abandoned. Crops rotted in the ground. In some places, there weren't enough plowmen left to till the soil. Imagine an entire village vanishing, houses empty, tools rusting, barns silent. The land was still there, but no one to work it. And nature crept back in fast. Chroniclers describe fields overgrown, weeds reclaiming farmland, wild animals multiplying, deer and boar wandering near villages, wolves showing up more often. Basically, parts of Europe began to look less like farmland and more like a wildlife preserve, which is nice for the deer, but less nice if you're a hungry peasant wondering where your bread is coming from. So what happened to food supplies? Well, at first there were shortages. Entire harvests lost. Grain prices shot up. Bread became scarcer. And in a world where bread was life, that was terrifying. Imagine standing in a bread line in 1348, hoping there's something left by the time you reach the front. But here's the twist. After the initial chaos, survivors actually found themselves in a weirdly better position. With so many fewer mouths to feed, suddenly food wasn't as scarce. Grain stores stretched further. Meat, usually expensive, became more available. Laborers could demand better wages and sometimes even payment in food. So yes, tragically, the plague killed millions, But for the survivors, diets often improved. And this shows up in farming itself. Before the Black Death, much of Europe was focused on grain-heavy farming, wheat, barley, rye, because feeding endless peasants meant endless bread. But after the plague, with less demand for sheer calories, agriculture shifted. More land went to pasture, sheep grazing expanded massively, wool became a booming industry, cows too, more dairy, more cheese, more butter. Instead of struggling to produce enough grain for a packed population, farmers diversified. They could afford to let fields lie fallow or even turn back to woodland. So, in a sense, the Black Death started a quiet revolution in European agriculture. Less gruel, more meat and dairy. And this had ripple effects. Peasants who once lived on endless barley mush could sometimes afford beef or mutton, not every day, but more often than before. They drank better ale. They ate fresher bread. Chroniclers even noted that peasants were dressing better, eating better, and sometimes, scandal of scandals, refusing to work unless paid more, which horrified the nobility. Because when you've built an entire society on peasants being half-starved and obedient, it's very inconvenient when they suddenly realize they don't have to be.
But famine still lingered around the edges. The 14th century was not exactly a golden age of food security. Just a few decades earlier, Europe had endured the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, years of torrential rain, crop failures, and starvation. And even after the Black Death, bad harvests still happened. 1 year of failed wheat could plunge entire regions into hunger. So while some peasants were enjoying more meat than ever before, others were still boiling whatever they could find. Accounts mention famine foods, grass, leaves, even shoe leather, which is a grim reminder that medieval diets were always one unlucky season away from collapse. And speaking of collapse, let's circle back to towns and cities. In the countryside, at least, you could scavenge, forage in the woods, milk a cow, trap a rabbit. But in cities, when food chains broke down, hunger became brutal. Markets emptied, bakers died, grain stopped arriving from the countryside. People in plague-stricken towns sometimes resorted to eating whatever was left behind in abandoned houses, which probably wasn't great. At the same time, though, survivors in towns sometimes lived like kings. Imagine walking into a half-deserted city with abandoned bakeries, granaries, even livestock wandering around. For a while, there was too much food for too few people. But as always, that only lasted until supplies rotted or rats took over. And here's something oddly modern. The Black Death also changed land values and food prices. With fewer peasants to work the land, lords had to offer better deals. Some survivors got access to more land, more grazing rights, even a little independence. Suddenly, food wasn't just survival, it was a bargaining chip. And this terrified the elite. Governments in England, France, and elsewhere scrambled to pass laws to freeze wages and food prices, trying desperately to keep peasants from getting uppity. Spoiler, it didn't work. People still demanded better. And food, humble bread, meat, cheese, became part of that struggle. So, here's the picture. On one hand, abandoned fields, weeds, wolves, and famine lurking around every bad harvest. On the other, survivors eating better than ever before, with more meat, more dairy, and a little more bargaining power. The Black Death was devastating, yes, but it cracked the rigid old food system wide open. Now, before we drift too far, let's add a small, sleepy irony. Medieval doctors sometimes claimed that eating rich food during the plague made you more vulnerable, that heavy meats and wines would clog your body with bad humors. Peasants, by accident, may have had the healthier diet all along, simpler, plainer, mostly vegetables and grains, while nobles, stuffing themselves with goose and sugared almonds, were ironically following the least plague-proof diet imaginable. Not that diet really helped against fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, but still, it's a funny thought. So in the end, food after the Black Death was messy.
Abandoned fields, rising wages, new diets, and shifting land use. Less bread, more meat, fewer people, more choices. A Europe stumbling out of plague with a very different relationship to what was on the table. In the next part, we'll float over to the strange rules, taboos, and beliefs about food during the Black Death. Because people didn't just eat for survival. They had endless superstitions about what foods could cure, prevent, or even cause the plague. Spoiler, none of them worked. But they make for some wonderfully bizarre medieval bedtime stories. So tuck that thought away. For now, picture an empty field once full of wheat, now quiet, overgrown, maybe a cow wandering loose. A continent half-starved, half-full, figuring out its next meal in a changed world.
So far, we've covered what peasants ate, what nobles flaunted, and how the plague left fields empty and diets shifting. But here's the thing about the medieval mindset. Food wasn't just food. It was medicine, morality, and sometimes even a weapon against invisible forces like demons or the plague itself. When people didn't understand germs, bacteria, or fleas, they filled the gaps with imaginative explanations, and food was right at the center of it. Let's start with the basics. According to medieval medical theory, the human body was ruled by the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If those were in balance, you were healthy. If not, you were in trouble. And since food was thought to directly affect those humors, every bite mattered. So during the Black Death, doctors weren't just recommending eat healthy, they were prescribing entire diets to prevent infection. Which, spoiler alert, didn't work. But it gave people a sense of control. For example, garlic. Medieval people loved garlic as a cure-all. Strong-smelling, pungent, and believed to draw away miasma, the bad air thought to spread plague. Some people ate it raw, others cooked it into everything, others wore it around their necks like an edible necklace. If vampires had been a real problem in 1349, Europe would have been doubly protected. Then there were onions. Onions, like garlic, were thought to draw out poisons. Some people placed sliced onions in their houses, believing they would absorb the plague from the air. Which is a charming image, a peasant family huddled inside with bowls of rotting onions scattered around, convinced they were soaking up disease. Not great for the nose, but hey, desperate times. Wine was another big one. Doctors often prescribed wine, but not just any wine. Spiced wine, mulled with herbs, was thought to purify the body and strengthen the humors. Red wine was especially popular since it looked like blood and therefore seemed to strengthen blood. Logic was flexible in the 14th century. Wealthy people sometimes drank wine mixed with ground pearls, believing the shimmering powder had medicinal properties, which is one way to make your urine very expensive. And then there were the forbidden foods. Doctors warned against eating fruit, especially fresh fruit. Why? Because fruit was considered moist and therefore dangerous during a plague believed to spread through damp, corrupted air. Apples, pears, plums, all seen as risky. Which is tragic, because in reality, fruit probably would have been one of the healthier options. Cold, raw foods in general were discouraged. Instead, people were told to eat warm, dry, spicy things, roasted meats with cinnamon, baked bread, hot soups, which just so happened to line up with what the rich could afford anyway. Funny how medical advice always seems to support the rich.
And let's not forget vinegar. Vinegar was the medieval hand sanitizer. People drank it, washed with it, sprinkled it on food, even carried sponges soaked in vinegar to sniff when they went outside. It was sharp, acidic, and purifying. Did it kill plague bacteria? No. But it did make everything taste like a very aggressive salad dressing. One of the stranger food beliefs involved eggs. Egg yolks were considered moist, but egg whites were thought to draw out poisons. Some plague remedies involved smearing egg white on sores or eating heavily spiced omelets. There's even a recipe for plague egg, where the yolk was discarded and the white whipped with herbs. It probably tasted like foamy grass clippings, but people swore by it. And then there was gold. Yes, gold. Some doctors claimed that eating gold in powdered form or leaf could cure plague. Nobles sometimes stirred flecks of gold into broth or wine, creating the medieval version of luxury health drinks. Did it help? Absolutely not. But it did prove that conspicuous consumption knows no boundaries, even in a pandemic. Meanwhile, peasants had their own food rituals. Herbal teas brewed from sage, rosemary, or thyme were thought to cleanse the body. Some chewed angelica root, believed to protect against disease. And fasting, going without food altogether, was sometimes recommended as a spiritual purification. Because if you couldn't afford venison with cinnamon, starving yourself was the next best cure. And then there were the outright bizarre cures. One text advised drinking a broth made from crushed emeralds. Another recommended consuming ground-up toads. Some people swore by plague jam, a sticky mixture of honey, herbs, and occasionally powdered precious stones. Imagine spreading that on your morning bread and hoping it would keep death away. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some argued that overeating made you vulnerable. Others believed undereating weakened you. Some said wine saved you, others said it doomed you. Medical advice was basically a buffet of contradictions, which in a way is comforting. Even in the 14th century, people couldn't agree on the right diet. And here's the irony. None of these foods, drinks, or concoctions made any real difference. Garlic, onions, vinegar, wine, they might have made the kitchen smell lively, but they didn't stop fleas. What they did provide was a sense of agency. When the world felt completely uncontrollable, choosing to eat garlic or drink vinegar was a way of saying, I can do something. And that, in itself, had value. So, to paint the scene, a noble sipping wine mixed with pearl dust while avoiding fresh fruit like it was poison. A peasant hanging onions in the rafters, convinced they'd suck the plague out of the air. A doctor prescribing vinegar gargles and egg white poultices. And somewhere in the corner, someone quietly nibbling bread and hoping for the best. A whole continent grasping at food as both comfort and cure, while the real culprit, a flea on a rat, scurried on unnoticed. In the next part, we'll drift into the social rituals around food during the Black Death, how families ate together, how meal times changed, and how death itself crept into the dining hall. Because food wasn't just nutrition, it was where people gathered, even when half the chairs at the table were suddenly empty. But for now, picture a medieval kitchen, smoky and dim, with garlic strings hanging from the beams, vinegar jars lined up on a shelf, and a pot of plague pottage bubbling over the fire. Comfort food with a side of superstition.
So we've talked about what peasants ate, what nobles flaunted, how farms were abandoned, and even the bizarre superstitions that made vinegar sound like a miracle drug. But now let's pause over the table itself. Because eating wasn't just about filling your stomach in the 14th century. It was about community, ritual, and a quiet sense of normalcy. And when the Black Death tore through Europe, those rituals became strangely hollow. Let's start with the medieval household meal. If you were a peasant family, dinner was usually eaten together, gathered around a rough wooden table, or sometimes just sitting on benches by the fire. There weren't individual plates. Instead, food was served in shared bowls, big pots plopped in the middle, with everyone dipping in. Bread doubled as a utensil, torn and dipped into pottage or broth. Spoons were wooden, knives were personal,
Forks, forget about it. Forks were still a suspicious Italian novelty. The mood was simple: quiet conversation, prayers before and after, maybe some gossip about the village. For peasants, meals were more about staying alive than about elaborate performance. Now compare that to noble dining. Noble meals were staged affairs. Picture a long hall, banners on the walls, tables arranged in rows. The lord and lady at the high table, elevated above the others. Servants bustling about. Everyone seated by rank, because even mealtime was a constant reminder of hierarchy. Food was served in courses, announced dramatically, sometimes accompanied by music. Trenchers of fine bread acted as plates, later fed to dogs or the poor. Wine flowed freely, and table manners were policed. Don't lick your knife too loudly. Don't guzzle like a barbarian. A medieval banquet was basically dinner theater, with hierarchy and ritual baked into every bite. But then came the plague. Suddenly, meals weren't just meals. They were reminders of loss. Imagine a peasant family sitting down to supper, one bowl of pottage, as always, but half the family is gone. The wooden bench feels too empty. The pot seems too large. Silence fills the space where chatter once was. Eating together, once comforting, became a nightly confrontation with absence. Noble tables filled it too. Chroniclers describe banquets where seats were left conspicuously unfilled. Lords dining with half their household gone. Servants missing. Musicians missing. Even kings, who had always eaten surrounded by a courtly audience, found themselves strangely alone. And then there were funerary feasts. In many communities, when someone died, it was customary to hold a meal in their honor. Bread, ale, maybe meat if the family could afford it, all shared with neighbors and kin. But during the Black Death, with so many dying so quickly, these meals blurred into a constant cycle. Families eating in mourning one week, then being mourned the next. Food and death intertwined in unsettling ways. Monks recorded meals eaten in silence after entire chapters of their brothers succumbed. Villages held communal dinners with empty chairs to represent the dead. Even feasting became tinged with grief.
And yet, people still tried to keep routines, because meals were one of the few anchors of daily life. The plague might rage outside, neighbors might vanish overnight, but the pot of pottage still simmered, the bread still needed baking, the ale still had to be brewed. Sitting down to eat, however diminished, was a way of saying, life continues. Interestingly, the plague also changed hospitality rituals. In medieval Europe, sharing food was central to social bonds. If a stranger came to your door, offering bread or drink was a sign of generosity, even holiness. But during the plague, that became dangerous. Inviting someone to sit at your table meant inviting in their fleas, their coughs, their bad air. So meals became more insular, hospitality shrank. The great medieval ideal of open feasting gave way to guarded family dinners, doors closed tight. A shift in the culture of eating that quietly reflected the paranoia of the age. And then there's religion. For Christians in 14th century Europe, mealtime prayers were already central. But during the Black Death, they took on desperate urgency. Blessings over bread weren't just thanks for food, they were pleas for survival. People sprinkled holy water on meals, made the sign of the cross over bread loaves, or gave the first slice to a church or monastery. Eating became part devotion, part superstition. In monasteries, communal meals were heavily affected. Some monastic refectories were cut in half, not intentionally, but because half the monks were dead. Silent dining, already a custom, became eerie in echoing halls with rows of empty seats. The ritual of food turned into a ritual of mourning. And let's not forget the symbolism of bread. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred, tied to the Eucharist. In times of plague, bread became even more charged with meaning. Sharing bread was sharing survival, sharing Christ, sharing hope. And the absence of bread, or the inability to provide it, felt like divine punishment. Now, here's a quieter angle. Imagine the psychological side of eating during the plague. The act of chewing bread, sipping ale, spooning out pottage, all familiar motions. But the taste must have been different. Not because the food changed, but because grief changes flavor. The same bowl of stew might feel comforting one night, hollow the next. Meals carried the weight of memory. Who used to sit across? Who ladled the pot last week? Who laughed over the bread trenchers? The Black Death turned ordinary dinners into nightly reminders that life was fragile. And yet, not every table was somber. Some survivors, paradoxically, feasted more than ever. There are accounts of nobles throwing grand banquets in the midst of the plague, determined to enjoy life before death claimed them. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die wasn't just a phrase, it was a lifestyle. Excessive eating, heavy drinking, laughter over groaning tables, all while the plague crept closer. So meal times could be grief or defiance or both at once. To sum it up, peasants huddled around a fire, sharing bowls that suddenly seemed too big. Nobles staging banquets with glaringly empty seats. Monks eating in silence, rows of benches half abandoned. Families saying prayers with more urgency than ever. And some, perhaps nervously, laughing too loudly at feasts, determined to ignore the shadow. The table, once a place of stability, became a stage where absence and survival sat side by side. In the next part, we'll float toward the markets and trade networks of the Black Death era, how food moved or didn't move across cities and countries, what disappeared from shelves, and how merchants tried to keep people fed while half their customers were dead. But for now, picture a flickering firelight, a wooden bowl, and a loaf of bread passed more slowly around the table than it had before, a mealtime that was the same as ever, and yet never the same again.